Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Clara Johnson, an elegant black woman in her 30s, walked down the economy aisle of her private flight to Miami. She wore a simple but refined outfit, her hair perfectly styled, and carried a discreet leather bag that in no way betrayed her true identity. Her eyes shone with a serenity that seemed incongruous given the hustle and bustle around her. As she settled into her seat, an arrogant and self-important flight attendant stared at her condescendingly. "Madam, this seat is reserved," he began, his tone a mixture of irritation and contempt. Clara, in a calm and gentle voice, explained that she had paid for her ticket like everyone else and had no problem showing her reservation. But the flight attendant, completely unaware of her status, shrugged and muttered disparaging remarks to his colleagues. A few passengers watched the scene with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement, some whispering among themselves about what they assumed was a simple airline service dispute. Clara, unperturbed, simply smiled politely, never looking down. What no one on board knew, least of all the arrogant crew, was that Clara was no ordinary traveler. Her husband, Michael Johnson, was the airline's owner, a respected and discreet businessman whose name resonated worldwide for his private transportation and luxury aviation empire. Simply humiliating her on board her own plane would prove to be a monumental mistake. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Clara sensed the moment had come. She calmly picked up her phone and, with a discreet gesture, sent a message. A few minutes later, the crew, still confident in their superiority, would discover that arrogance and contempt sometimes come at a very high price. Clara Johnson stepped down the narrow aisle of the plane, holding her leather bag with effortless elegance. Every step seemed calculated, calm, and controlled. Yet, as soon as she met the gaze of the chief flight attendant, her composure was tested. "Madam, you cannot sit here, this seat is for," he began, frowning. His voice was condescending, and his eyes roamed over Clara as if he were assessing her appearance before even checking her ticket. "I assure you, this is my seat," Clara replied, with a polite but firm smile. She held out her electronic ticket, clearly displaying her seat number. The steward sighed, annoyed, and gestured to his colleagues. "Seriously, I don't understand why she insists." A passenger behind Clara let out a nervous chuckle. Others murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads at what they perceived as a ridiculous conflict. Clara felt several passengers staring at her, a mixture of curiosity and silent judgment. The self-satisfied steward made a decision. "Very well, but if you need anything, I warn you, you will have to follow our rules." His words were full of contempt, and his condescending smile betrayed that he thought he had complete control of the situation. Clara finally sat down, taking a deep breath. She knew this public humiliation was just a facade, and that she had the means to turn the situation around. Her face remained impassive, but behind her eyes shone the determination of someone who would never be put down. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Clara discreetly pulled out her phone and typed a few words. This simple gesture would soon turn what she had just endured into a memorable lesson for all those who had dared to underestimate her. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Clara felt the atmosphere around her change. The passengers' murmurs continued, and some cast curious glances her way, intrigued by the way the flight attendant seemed both irritated and nervous. The steward, Mark Reynolds, a closed-faced man in his 30s, wasn't used to being challenged. He paced up and down the aisle, glancing furtively at Clara, as if searching for a flaw, a weakness. But Clara remained motionless, perfectly erect, her expression calm and unperturbed. "What's behind that smile, madam?" Mark whispered to his colleague, his tone mocking, but his voice betrayed a hint of concern. Clara, aware of every movement, stood up slightly to adjust her seat. She said nothing, but her attitude posed a silent question: what if I don't let myself be done? Suddenly, the pilot announced over the loudspeaker, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will soon reach our cruising altitude. Please fasten your seat belts and remain seated." Mark frowned. He thought he had the situation under control, but something was eluding him. The passengers were beginning to notice an unusual tension between him and Clara. A murmur ran through the cabin, Some whispered that the passenger seemed to belong to a high social class, but Mark, blinded by his arrogance, still didn't understand. Clara, for her part, remained focused on her phone. A simple message, sent silently, would soon shatter the flight attendant's illusion of superiority. She needed no dramatic gesture to prepare her revenge. Patience and discretion would be enough to transform her humiliation into a memorable lesson. And as the plane sliced through the sky, the reality of what Mark had wrought began to sink in. Little did he know, he'd chosen the wrong passenger to humiliate. A few hours had passed since boarding, and the plane was now flying calmly above the clouds. Clara sat impassively, but her attention was fully focused on what was happening around her. Every movement of the flight attendants, every glance of the passengers, she observed with precision, like a strategist planning her next move. Mark Reynolds, growing increasingly frustrated, kept returning to his seat, eyeing Clara suspiciously. "I still don't understand why she insisted on staying here," he whispered to a flight attendant, thinking no one else would hear. But his colleagues, already intrigued by Clara's calm and confident demeanor, began to wonder, too. Meanwhile, Clara discreetly opened a small notebook in her bag. The few pages she flipped through contained notes about the airline, contacts, and subtle reminders of her personal and professional life. Nothing flashy, nothing that betrayed her rank, but for her, it was enough to know that the time to reveal her identity was approaching. A passenger sitting in front of her, a businessman in his 50s, began to chat with the person next to him. "This woman, she doesn't behave like a simple traveler. Don't you think there's something special about her?" Mark, hearing the remark, felt a shiver of worry. His arrogance was beginning to waver slightly. But true to his character, he chose to ignore the foreboding and continue to impose his authority. Clara, however, remained calm and her smile discreet. Every small gesture, every word Mark spoke, reinforced his silent plan. She knew that the real humiliation would come not from an immediate verbal conflict, but from the unexpected revelation of who she really was. The blue sky continued to roll past the windows, but inside the cabin, an invisible tension was building. The first cracks in Mark's illusion of power were already appearing, and Clara knew she was approaching the moment when everything would change. Clara Johnson calmly observed the aisles of the plane. Every movement of the staff, every forced smile, every condescending remark from Mark Reynolds was etched in her mind. She knew that timing would be everything, and that patience would be her most valuable ally. Discreetly, she pulled out her phone and checked the message she'd sent one last time. Moments later, she received a silent response, a simple "Roger," accompanied by a discreet emoji. That was enough. The plan could now enter its final phase. Mark, still believing he was in control, continued to walk by her seat to check that Clara was still under control. He didn't notice the other passengers' persistent stares, nor their increasingly curious murmurs. Some had begun to whisper about Clara's confidence and bearing, instinctively sensing that she was no ordinary traveler. Clara stood up slightly, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and said calmly but firmly, "Excuse me, I'm going to the bathroom." Nothing unusual, yet at that precise moment, she knew that all the eyes of the flight attendants were on her. Just the act of moving confidently was already beginning to shake Mark's arrogance. As she walked down the aisle, Clara made a subtle gesture with her right hand, a small sign that only a few of her accomplices could understand. This gesture triggered a series of perfectly synchronized actions. Discreet calls were made, documents began to be checked, and some passengers' attention focused on their phones. Mark, not understanding what was happening, felt a first surge of panic. His colleagues murmured among themselves, visibly worried. Clara, for her part, returned to her seat with a slight smile, as if nothing had happened. But in reality, she knew that the moment of revelation was approaching. The apparent calm in the cabin masked a growing tension. Soon, Mark would discover he had humiliated the wrong person, and the lesson he was about to receive would be memorable. As the plane continued its flight, Clara Johnson stood up calmly, this time with determination visible in her eyes. All eyes were on her, but she walked as if she had always belonged there. Mark Reynolds, convinced that he was going to impose his authority again, stood in front of her. "Madam, you must remain seated," he said sharply, hoping to intimidate Clara. Clara stopped, looked him straight in the eyes and replied, in a perfectly poised voice. "Mr. Reynolds, I think you forgot an important detail." At that precise moment, she took out her phone and discreetly projected a document onto the screen of the plane's internal communications system, accessible to crew members. The document bore her name and the exact title, Clara Johnson, owner of Johnson Aviation Group. An instant silence fell over the cabin. The passengers, initially surprised, exchanged incredulous glances. The crew, for their part, paled as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. Mark took a step back, his mouth hanging open. You're the owner?" he stammered, unable to form anything else. Clara nodded slowly, her smile remaining polite but firm. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds. And it seems to me that your words and behavior toward me during boarding didn't really meet the standards of respect we hold within our company." The tension rose further when Clara continued, "I suggest you reconsider your attitude and apologize immediately." Mark, unsettled, searched for words but found none. The other crew members stood there, ashamed, realizing that their arrogance would cost them dearly. Clara, still calm, sat down again, but this time with the certainty that the balance of power had changed radically. Every passenger in the cabin felt the impact of this revelation. A simple woman, treated with contempt only hours earlier, had just turned the tables with undeniable elegance and authority. And as the plane sped through the sky, the lesson was clear to everyone on staff: underestimating someone, even for a moment, can have dramatic consequences. After the public revelation of her identity, Clara remained perfectly calm, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But in the cabin, the atmosphere had changed radically. Every member of staff now felt the weight of their own mistake. Mark Reynolds struggled to regain his composure, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. The other crew members avoided his gaze, some whispering among themselves, visibly embarrassed. Clara spoke in a calm but authoritative voice. "I want each of you to understand that respect and courtesy are not optional, whether you are dealing with an ordinary passenger or with me. Your attitudes determine the image of our company." She paused briefly, letting her words permeate the cabin. Several passengers nodded silently, some smiling complicitly, impressed by her poise and composure. Then, with a subtle gesture, Clara took out her phone again and sent a message to the ground crew: "Prepare the staff behavior report." "Thank you." A few minutes later, Mark received a discreet call on his own phone from the head office. The voice on the other end was clear and firm. "Mr. Reynolds, we have become aware of the situation. Your attitude toward Ms. Johnson does not meet our company's standards. You will be summoned upon landing for a disciplinary interview." The rest of the crew felt a mixture of fear and shame. Even the passengers, intrigued, understood that Clara had not only restored her dignity, but had also exercised her authority in a subtle and effective way. Clara, for her part, leaned slightly to thank a passenger who had offered her a sympathetic smile. Then she sat back, impassive, leaving Mark and his colleagues to digest the lesson. Revenge, she believed, didn't need to be spectacular. Sometimes, elegance and calm were enough to make an impression. And as the plane approached Miami, Clara knew that the real change had just taken place. A simple humiliation had been transformed into a memorable lesson about respect, dignity, and the subtle power of authority. The plane finally landed in Miami. Clara Johnson calmly adjusted her bag on her shoulder and stood. Each step down the aisle seemed to measure the distance between the humiliation she had suffered and the quiet triumph she now commanded. Passengers stood to retrieve their belongings, some looking at her with admiration, others with surprise. Mark Reynolds, visibly nervous, tried to maintain a professional appearance. He stood straight, but his hands trembled slightly, and his face paled as Clara moved toward the exit. The whispers from the booth revealed that Mark's reputation had just wavered in front of everyone. Arriving at the plane door, Clara took a moment to address the crew. "Thank you for your service," she said calmly. "But I hope this experience has reminded you of the importance of respect and courtesy, no matter the situation." The words, simple but sharp, hit the crew hard. Mark opened his mouth to reply, but no sound came out. Even his colleagues remained silent, aware that their arrogance had been exposed in front of all the passengers. Moments later, Clara stepped off the plane and was greeted on the ground by one of her assistants, who was tasked with ensuring that all aircraft personnel received an official report on her behavior. Mark, still frozen on the tarmac, understood that his actions would have immediate and tangible consequences: disciplinary action, warnings, and a long-term tarnished reputation. Clara walked away confidently, each step echoing like a silent victory. The passengers passing her murmured among themselves, impressed by how a mere woman had turned a conflict situation into a display of authority and power. On the way to the terminal, Clara let out a small, satisfied smile. The humiliation of leaving had been transformed into a life lesson for those who thought they could underestimate her. And as the Miami sun lit up her silhouette, she knew that true power lay not in shouting or blaming, but in self-control and silent strategy. Once off the plane, Clara Johnson settled into the temporary office her team had prepared to handle ground monitoring. Company assistants were already reviewing the crew's personnel files, preparing disciplinary reports and detailed accounts of the incident. Clara took a deep breath and began to review the facts: Mark Reynolds's treatment of her, his condescending remarks, and his blatant disregard for protocol. Every line of her report reflected the precision and neutrality of a person who left nothing to chance. Shortly after, Mark's phone rang. He hesitated before answering and heard Clara's calm but firm voice. "Mr. Reynolds, your actions on board the aircraft have been carefully reviewed. I am informing you that disciplinary action will be taken against you. You will receive a formal warning and mandatory follow-up training on customer service and passenger respect." Mark remained silent, unable to protest or argue. The lesson had been taught, and it was irrevocable. Clara continued, "I advise you to reflect on your behavior and correct it. Our standards are clear: no passenger should be humiliated, regardless of their appearance or status." Clara's assistants noted every word, ensuring the process was official and beyond reproach. Other crew members, who had witnessed the incident and now realized the gravity of their actions, were summoned for interviews, each realizing that mere arrogance had no place in the company. Clara, sitting in her office, released a small smile. Her revenge wasn't loud, but it was complete. Respect had been restored, and everyone involved had learned their lesson. She had transformed a personal humiliation into a subtle and lasting display of power. As the Miami sun bathed the offices in light, Clara knew this experience would be recounted repeatedly, not as a scandal, but as proof of what power truly meant: mastery, patience, and strategic intelligence. In the days following the incident, the repercussions of the confrontation on board the plane were felt at every level of the company. Clara Johnson's name circulated throughout all departments, not as a mere owner, but as a figure capable of transforming a moment of humiliation into a demonstration of leadership and respect. Mark Reynolds, who had received his official warning, was now silent and attentive, aware that every future misstep would be closely scrutinized. His colleagues, too, had learned never to underestimate passengers again, and especially never to ignore Clara's authority, even when she appeared to be traveling incognito. Clara, for her part, monitored every step of the process. She personally oversaw the staff training sessions, ensuring that the lesson was understood and applied in the long term. Passengers who had witnessed the scene on board still praised her, some even complimenting her on her mastery of the situation and her grace in the face of provocation. But for Clara, this wasn't just a personal vendetta. She wanted this incident to serve as an example to the entire company: respect, attention to detail, and courtesy toward every passenger were non-negotiable. Her message was clear and effective: underestimating someone could be very costly, not only in the moment, but also in the long-term consequences. Even regular passengers began to share the story, turning the incident into a famous anecdote in the airline industry. Clara's image, calm and imposing, facing down the arrogance of the staff without ever raising her voice, became a model of quiet leadership and subtle authority. With every report, every briefing, every feedback, Clara was solidifying her reputation. She had transformed a humiliating situation into a strategic triumph, and the snowball effect of her intervention was beginning to redefine the company's standards. The staff, now aware of their power, behaved differently, not out of gratuitous fear, but out of genuine respect for the authority and dignity that Clara embodied. A few days after the incident, Clara Johnson arrived in Miami again, this time to oversee a general audit of her company. But for her, the episode on board the plane was still fresh in everyone's memory. The employees, now aware of the importance of respect and courtesy, welcomed her with renewed attention, each one carefully considering their words and actions. Mark Reynolds, more humble and attentive than ever, avoided her gaze but remained at his post, determined to redeem himself. The other crew members, having undergone the training Clara had imposed, displayed impeccable professionalism. The initial humiliation had been transformed into a lasting lesson, and the company itself had gained a reputation for Clara's graceful handling of the situation. Clara, walking the corridors of her temporary headquarters, observed the attentive and respectful faces of the employees. No forced smiles, no mocking murmurs. Everything was silent, but heavy with understanding. She knew that true revenge never required outrage or noisy confrontation. The respect commanded by mastery and strategy was worth 1,000 public humiliations. As she left the building, Clara took a moment to watch the sunset over Miami. Each ray illuminated not only the city, but also the silent victory she had just achieved. The initial humiliation on the plane was now a distant memory, transformed into an example for all those who had dared to underestimate her. In her wake, Clara left a clear lesson: dignity, patience, and strategy always trump vanity and arrogance. And for those who thought they could belittle her, the message was forever etched: Clara Johnson is never underestimated. Months after the incident on board the plane, the impact of Clara Johnson's confrontation continued to be felt throughout the company. Staff training protocols had been strengthened, and every crew member knew that respect and courtesy toward passengers were the cornerstone of their job. Mark Reynolds, now more humble and attentive, had become a model of professional transformation. His nervousness had given way to a thoughtful and respectful attitude. The other staff members had also adopted this new approach, understanding that true authority was not demonstrated through force or arrogance, but through self-control and strategy. Clara Johnson's reputation had spread beyond the company. Regular passengers and business partners still told the story of the owner calmly regaining control of a situation of public humiliation, commanding respect with elegance and intelligence. Her subtle yet firm approach left a lasting impression on all who witnessed her actions. For Clara, this experience wasn't just a personal revenge. It was a clear and inspiring message: dignity, patience, and perseverance always overcome arrogance and contempt. And even in situations where one seems vulnerable or ignored, it is possible to turn the situation around with intelligence and composure. As she watched the sun set over Miami once again, Clara felt satisfied and confident. She had not only restored her honor, but she had also left a lasting lesson in the minds of all those who had dared to underestimate her. The story of this silent but memorable confrontation would continue to be told, a testament to power, respect, and self-control. And so Clara Johnson remained, not only the owner of the company, but an emblematic figure of subtle authority and unshakable dignity.